Hi, Peter Mary here, the Fun Wedding Guy, and today we're going to dig another layer deeper into the grand entrance video footage of DJ Ramu from the Boston and Rhode Island area. And today we're going to take a look at who is being talked about and what is being said in relation to the family members and the wedding party members. Now, first and foremost, I have to tell you, one of my personal pet peeves is when I hear the bridal party called the bridal party. Bride usually refers to the bride. When you go to a bridal store, you expect to find bridal gowns for the bride. You don't expect to find tuxedos. When you go to a bridal shower, you don't expect to see too many men there because it's something that's for the bride and her female friends. So when you think of bridal party, I tend to think of the bridesmaids and the bride. The more technically accurate term, I think, is wedding party. The guests think in terms of the wedding party when they think of the bridesmaids and the groomsmen. That's another point to consider. In this video, the groomsmen are introduced as ushers. I'll have to look at the etiquette books to be sure, but I'm pretty certain that groomsmen and ushers fulfill a slightly different role. Sometimes you have ushers who will escort the family members down and seat the guests that are coming in, but then you have groomsmen who are separate because they're the ones who stand up front with the groom and the best man in his lineup, whereas the ushers don't usually line up during the wedding ceremony. So referring to groomsmen as ushers actually diminishes their role and their title, and it's an incorrect title for the role that they're actually fulfilling. I've had many weddings where I've introduced the ushers into the room and then began introducing the wedding party. The ushers are not technically part of the wedding party. The wedding party would be people who walk down the aisle and stand up front with the bride and groom. In fact, the parents and grandparents aren't even technically part of the wedding party. They're the family members. They are guests of honor. Sometimes they're even the hosts, but they are not the wedding party or the bridal party. So let's start with that. The first people that are introduced, he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome the grandparents of the bride, Mrs. Anne Hebern and Mrs. Anita Beaumier." The thing I found interesting about that is it sounds like that's coming off of a regular script because you said grandparents. And yes, technically both of her grandmothers are her grandparents, but that usually implies that both sexes are going to be present, and since both of them were by themselves, I'm assuming they're both widowed, and so it would be more appropriate, since she has two grandmothers, to say her grandmothers. Why not say grandmothers instead of grandparents? It'd be more precise, more accurate, and it doesn't have people looking to figure out where granddads are that are no longer with us. The other point that I would make is that when these family members of the bride and groom are being introduced, he says the grandparents of the bride, the parents of the bride, the parents of the groom. Here's a consideration. Once again, the guests are there not for the location, but for the event. And what is the event? It is the wedding reception celebration for Louis and Kristen. So to be more formal and personal and connect the dots for the guests in a more endearing way, why not use their names? It wouldn't be that much more difficult to say, "And now please help me welcome Kristen's grandmothers, Mrs. Anne Hebern and Anita Beaumier." If you introduce them that way, it would be a little bit more formal and a little bit more personal and connect the dots a little bit more for people because you're saying their names. Everybody already knows they're the bride and groom. They're wearing the uniform. They got the invitation 6 weeks ago. But all the guests that are in that room are in that room for one reason. Somehow they're connected to either Louis or Kristen or both. They're there because they know Louis and Kristen. So the more you use their names to connect the dots on who these people are to them, the more effective what you're saying is going to be. You then introduced the grandparents of the groom, Mr. and Mrs. Martin Asnavarian, and I got a comment that you did a fantastic job pronouncing the names. Those are some really tricky names, and you obviously had done some preparation on that, so thumbs up. I've seen a lot of DJs who really don't spend a lot of time preparing, and then they butcher names, especially important names like those. Then you said, "How about a nice round of applause for the parents of the bride, Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth Beaumier." Now, when you introduced the parents and the grandparents that were couples, the thing that I noticed, and this went all the way through to the bride and groom, was that you introduced them formally according to the old-fashioned standards, which is Mr. and Mrs., husband's name, last name, no wife's name. This is 2010. I think it's time to start using the wife's name. I think it's helpful to use the wife's name. It's easier to not have to put that in there, but by putting that extra information in there, it once again makes everybody feel more connected, and it makes it feel more relevant because you're actually introducing two people. I do understand that the old-fashioned traditional way of saying it would be to say Mr. and Mrs. Michael Parker. But if you said Mr. and Mrs. Michael and Sally Parker, that tells you who his wife is and what her name is. So when you're introducing a couple, I would highly recommend using both names unless the bride and groom specifically ask that you don't. In the grand entrance footage I posted on April 11th from my April 10th wedding, the bride requested that I do it the old-fashioned traditional way. That's why I introduced them as Mr. and Mrs. Steve Fisher. She opted for that, but I gave her the option to include her name, and if you'll notice in that grand entrance, I used her and his name all throughout, because this is their celebration and that's the way everybody thinks about them. So we need to keep that in mind. So then you introduced the bride's parents, then you introduced the groom's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Parker. Then you introduced the parents of the groom again, Mr. and Mrs. Louis DeMarco Jr. Now, I'm not the most brilliant person in the world, but I figured out that that was the groom's father and his wife, and the previous couple had been the groom's mother and her husband. But because you didn't say the groom's mom's name, and you didn't identify that that was his mom, if I was a guest who didn't know, I would still be a little confused on who that was, and now I'm having to do mental gymnastics to figure out who's connected to who. Maybe you don't want to say step-parent, so instead you say, please help me welcome Louis's mother, Mary Parker, and her husband Michael. Okay, now you're not saying stepfather, but you're introducing his mom as the guest of honor with her husband, so it's apparent that that's her husband. And I'd also like to introduce Louis's father, Louis DeMarco Jr., and his wife, Mary Ann. Okay, so that's another way that you could introduce them, make it more personal and relevant, but also highlighting who's important here. When you introduce the mother of the groom as Mr. and Mrs. Michael Parker, and you don't even give her first name, she has an important role that day. And it would be very wise to consider including her name and starting with her name and then saying with her husband if she's remarried. If her and Louis were still married, you would use his name and her name and then the last name. That's the way to do it that makes it more personal and connected for everybody. So those are some thoughts to think about. Then when it was time to introduce the wedding party, please help me welcome our bridesmaid, Jenna Barnett, escorted by our usher, Michael Sarabian. Once again, good pronunciation of names. Bridesmaid Felicia Beaumier, with usher Victor Sarabian, Angelica Beaumier, and Michael Asnavorian. Now here's the thing I found interesting. I see Felicia Beaumier, I see Angelica Beaumier, I see Kevin Beaumier. These are people who are obviously brothers or sisters or cousins of the bride. How hard would it have been, instead of saying bridesmaid, to say bridesmaid Kristen's sister, Felicia Beaumier? Adding that extra line connects the dots for the guests on who those people are. And when you connect the dots for the guests on who those people are, once again, they feel more connected, they feel more invested, they feel more attached to what's going on. They're not sitting there wondering who those people are, and you have no idea how often guests sit there and watch people get introduced and all that's said is their names and they still have no idea who they are. I'm not advising that every DJ should try and do the kind of personalized grand entrance that I do, where I expound on them, sometimes at length. But I am advising that if you're going to be the master of ceremonies and introduce these important people who were important enough that the bride and groom asked them to go buy outfits and take time off and come to a rehearsal and go to a rehearsal dinner and come to showers and now be in their wedding party and maybe even make a toast, if you're not going to take the time to connect the dots on who they are to the bride and groom, why are you even bothering to introduce them? An introduction is more than just saying somebody's name. An introduction tells you who that person is. And telling who that person is to the bride and groom is so valuable, it will make a huge difference to the way the guests perceive what you're doing as a master of ceremonies. I've had weddings where I've just introduced by connecting who they are and what their relationship is to the bride and groom, just that added value, and I've had people come up and say, I've never seen a grand entrance like this. Why? Because they're sitting out there wondering who those people are. So I'm not telling you to do what I do, but I am telling you as the master of ceremonies, if you take the time to add in just 2 more pieces of text, the bride's sister, the bride's cousin, the bride's friend from high school, just that little tidbit more would make a huge difference. And once again, don't say bride, say Kristen. Kristen's sister, Kristen's friend from college. It makes it more personal, and the more personal you make it, the better it's going to be. And then you introduce the bride and the groom, and here's my biggest piece of feedback about that. 5 minutes into the video, when the bride and groom come into the room, you finally say their names for the first time. You never said their names at the beginning. You didn't connect to the guests who this event was for and what this was about. You've used bride and groom all the way up to this point, and then you finally say their name. And you have to follow up with a line that says, make some noise if you think Kristen's the most beautiful woman in the room. Which might be leaving a few married men feeling awkward with their wives standing right next to them. When you use the bride and groom's names throughout and make it more personal, your guests will see more value in what you do, and they will beat a path to your door. We're going to talk more about this as we finish our wrap-up on Ramu's video tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in. Feel free to post your comments on the blog. My name is Peter Mary, and you've been watching The Fun Wedding Guy.